When we picture the icons of the Second World War, we conjure images of roaring P-51 Mustangs cutting through the clouds, the relentless tread of Sherman tanks, or the colossal, earth-shaking form of a B-17 Flying Fortress. These are the machines of offensive power, the sharp tip of the spear. But behind this sharp tip was an immense and unwieldy shaft, the logistical tail, the greatest challenge of modern warfare. For every soldier on the front line, there were 7 to 10 behind him, supporting him. And all of them needed shelter. They needed barracks, hospitals, mess halls, workshops, and command posts. They needed them instantly, on every conceivable terrain, from the frozen tundra of the Aleutians to the sweltering, pestilential jungles of the South Pacific. This was a problem that could not be solved with traditional brick and mortar. The war demanded a new kind of weapon, one not designed to kill, but to protect, to enable, and to endure. Its story begins not with a bang, but with a blueprint, and its hero is one of the most unassuming yet revolutionary pieces of technology to emerge from the conflict, the Quonset Hut. In the chaotic aftermath of America's entry into the war, the United States Navy faced a logistical nightmare of unprecedented scale. The Japanese advance in the Pacific was rapid, and the US needed to establish a vast network of forward bases across thousands of miles of ocean. The traditional wooden frame structures were too slow to build, required skilled labor, and consumed precious cargo space on transport ships. They were also vulnerable to bomb blasts, to weather, and to rot. The Navy needed something that could be shipped in a compact crate, assembled by a handful of unskilled men in a matter of hours, and withstand the brutal forces of nature and war. It needed a building that was, in essence, disposable yet indestructible, a universal shelter that could be anything, anywhere. The answer was found not in a grand architectural firm, but in the offices of the George A. Fuller Construction Company, which was tasked by the Navy in 1941 to create a cheap, lightweight, all-purpose building. The team, working at the Quonset Point Naval Air Station in Rhode Island, the hut's namesake, looked for inspiration. They found it in an unlikely place, the enemy. Well, a former enemy. During the First World War, the British had developed the Quonset Hut, a semi-cylindrical structure of corrugated steel. It was a functional design, but it had its flaws. It was dark, cramped, and poorly ventilated. The American engineers took this basic concept and refined it with a characteristically Yankee blend of pragmatism and industrial genius. They didn't just copy the Quonset Hut, they re-engineered it for a global war. What emerged from Quonset Point was a masterpiece of simplicity. The standard Quonset Hut was a half-cylinder, 16 feet by 36 feet, built from corrugated galvanized steel. Its arched form was its strength. Like an eggshell, the curved surface distributed stress evenly, making it incredibly resilient to wind, heavy snow loads, and even the concussive force of nearby explosions. It had no internal supports, no load-bearing walls, creating a vast, open, and flexible interior space. It was a blank canvas. With a few simple partitions, it could be transformed from a barracks for 20 men into a surgical operating theater, a vehicle repair shop, a communications center, or a warehouse for ammunition. But the true genius of the Quonset Hut was not just in its final form, but in its journey to the front. It was designed for mass production on an industrial scale. The components were simple, repetitive, and could be stamped out by the thousands in stateside factories. A complete hut, with all its parts, the arched T-ribs, the corrugated steel sheets, the end walls, and the necessary bolts, could be packed into a single, compact crate. This was a logistical dream. These crates could be stacked high in the holds of Liberty ships, taking up a fraction of the space of prefabricated lumber. They could be parachuted into inaccessible areas, towed on barges up jungle rivers, or manhandled ashore in the first waves of an invasion. Once at its destination, the hut's second miracle unfolded, its assembly. No highly trained engineers were needed. The Navy's official manual promised that a team of 10 unskilled men could erect a Quonset Hut in a single day. The process was like a giant, military-grade erector set. The foundation was simple, a wooden frame or concrete piers. The rib arches were slotted together and hoisted into place. Then, starting from the bottom, the corrugated steel sheets were bolted on, each one adding to the structure's strength. The simplicity was breathtaking. In a matter of hours, a barren patch of Pacific coral, a windswept English field, or a muddy French lane could be transformed into an organized, weatherproof military installation. The Quonset Hut, therefore, is not merely a building. It is a story. It is the story of American industrial might applied to a human problem. It is a story of innovation born from desperation. While the world was focused on the destructive power of the machines of war, this humble, curved hut was playing an equally vital role. It sheltered the planners who drew up the invasion maps, it healed the wounded soldiers evacuated from the front, and it housed the engineers who kept the tanks rolling. It was the unsung hero, the ubiquitous background player in the vast drama of a global conflict. It was a testament to the idea that winning a war is not just about destroying the enemy, but about sustaining your own forces. And as the war progressed, this unassuming tin can would prove its mettle in ways its designers could never have imagined, facing down some of the most extreme conditions on Earth and becoming a symbol of American ingenuity and resilience. In the opening months of 1941, the United States Navy was staring into an abyss of its own making. The strategic pivot towards a Europe First policy, agreed upon with the British, carried a terrifying corollary in the Pacific, a defensive, holding action against the relentless expansion of the Japanese Empire. This was not a temporary setback, it was a fundamental logistical equation that seemed almost unsolvable. To halt the Japanese advance and eventually push back, the US would need to create, supply, and maintain a vast network of forward operating bases across thousands of miles of the world's most unforgiving ocean. This strategic imperative gave birth to an operational demand so specific, so urgent, and so extreme that it bordered on the impossible. The Navy didn't just need buildings, it needed a miracle of logistics, and it needed it yesterday. The problem was multifaceted and brutal in its simplicity. First was the issue of volume. The number of structures required was staggering. A single advanced naval base required barracks for thousands of men, warehouses for ammunition and spare parts, machine shops for repairing everything from aircraft engines to radio sets, hospitals, command centers, and mess halls. Traditional construction was a non-starter. Sending shiploads of lumber, bricks, mortar, and, most critically, teams of skilled carpenters and masons to every remote atoll and jungle island was a fantasy. It was too slow, too resource-intensive, and far too vulnerable. The war would be won or lost by the speed of deployment, and traditional building methods were a recipe for a stalemate, if not outright defeat. Second was the tyranny of distance and cargo space. The Pacific theater was a logistical black hole. Every single nail, plank, and gallon of fresh water had to be transported across thousands of miles of submarine-infested waters. The Liberty ships and transport vessels were the lifeline of the entire war effort, and their capacity was the most precious commodity on Earth. Wasting this capacity on bulky, irregularly shaped building materials was a strategic crime. A new type of structure had to be designed that could be disassembled into flat-packed, standardized components, capable of being stacked with geometric efficiency in the holds of ships. It had to be a building that could, in essence, be mailed. Third was the enemy of time. From the moment an island was secured by the Marines, the clock started ticking. That island needed to be transformed from a blood-soaked battleground into a functioning airbase or naval station within weeks, sometimes days. The Japanese would be counterattacking by air and sea. There was no time for a months-long construction project. The assembly process had to be so simple that sleep-deprived, combat-stressed sailors and construction battalion personnel, the famed Seabees, could execute it with minimal training, using only basic tools. The learning curve had to be nearly vertical. Finally, and perhaps most dauntingly, was the challenge of environment. This universal building would have to perform flawlessly in conditions that would destroy a conventional structure. It needed to shrug off the 150-mile-per-hour winds of a Pacific typhoon. Its roof had to bear the weight of torrential rainfall and, in northern latitudes, meters of heavy, wet snow without collapsing. In the jungles of New Guinea or Guadalcanal, it had to resist relentless humidity, mold, and voracious insects. On barren, sun-scorched atolls, it had to provide some semblance of shade and ventilation. It had to be resilient against the concussive force of nearby bomb blasts, which could collapse ordinary buildings with shockwaves alone. It was not enough for this building to exist, it had to endure. This was the impossible demand presented to the engineers and architects contracted by the Navy. The brief was a study in contradictions: create a structure that was lightweight yet incredibly strong, cheap and disposable yet durable enough to withstand extreme weather, simple to assemble yet versatile enough to serve a dozen different functions, and compact to ship yet spacious inside. It was a problem that could not be solved by incremental improvements to existing designs. It required a fundamental reimagining of what a building was. The pressure was immense. The disaster at Pearl Harbor had shattered any illusion of American invulnerability. The Japanese were advancing seemingly unchecked through Southeast Asia. The Philippines were under siege. Every day spent designing was a day lost in the race to arm America's far-flung defensive perimeter. The Navy wasn't asking for a theoretical solution, it was demanding a tangible product, and fast. This atmosphere of acute crisis is the crucial context for the birth of the Quonset Hut. It was not designed in a vacuum of academic curiosity. It was forged in the white-hot furnace of necessity. The engineers at the George A. Fuller Company were not merely designing a shelter, they were designing a strategic asset. They understood that the success of their project would be measured not in architectural awards, but in its ability to accelerate the buildup of American military power across the globe. The Quonset Hut was, from its very inception, a weapon. Its battlefield was the entire Pacific Ocean, and its mission was to provide the infrastructure for victory. The impossible demand had been issued. The race to meet it was on. The story of the Quonset Hut is often told as a pure triumph of American ingenuity, a novel invention born from the urgent needs of the U.S. Navy. While the final product was indeed a masterpiece of stateside engineering, its genesis was not a creation from a void. The brilliant minds at the George A. Fuller Company did not start with a blank slate. They began with a proven, if flawed, blueprint, a design that had already been tested in the crucible of a previous world war. The true spark of inspiration for the Quonset Hut came from an unlikely and politically awkward source, a British design known as the Nissen Hut, a structure whose own origins were deeply intertwined with the trench warfare of the Western Front. In 1916, as the Great War settled into its grueling, static phase, a Canadian-American mining engineer serving in the British Army, Major Peter Norman Nissen, was tasked with solving a problem eerily similar to the one the U.S. Navy would face 25 years later. The British Expeditionary Force needed rapidly deployable, durable shelters for the men and material massed behind the lines. The existing canvas tents and wooden huts were inadequate, they were cold, damp, offered poor protection from shell fragments, and took too long to erect. Nissen, applying his practical engineering mindset, conceived of a semi-cylindrical shelter built from a steel frame and covered with corrugated iron sheets. Its arch design was its key feature, providing inherent strength and allowing it to be prefabricated and shipped in compact loads. The first Nissen huts began appearing on the Western Front in 1916, and by the war's end, over 100,000 had been produced. When the American engineers began their project in 1941, the Nissen Hut presented an obvious and logical starting point. It was a known quantity. It had proven its basic viability under combat conditions. Its fundamental principle, the strength of the arch, was sound. But the Nissen Hut of 1916 was, by 1941 standards, a primitive and deeply unpopular structure among the troops who had to inhabit it. It was this unpopularity, born of specific design flaws, that provided the American team with a clear roadmap for improvement. They weren't just copying the Nissen, they were conducting a thorough engineering postmortem to perfect it. The first and most glaring flaw of the Nissen Hut was its interior space. The original design featured a low, 8-foot headroom at the center that sloped sharply down to barely 5 feet at the walls. This created a cramped, claustrophobic feeling and rendered a significant portion of the floor space practically unusable. A soldier could not stand upright except in the very center of their hut. The American engineers addressed this by designing a taller, more generous arch for the Quonset Hut. The standard model provided a clear, open interior from floor to ceiling, with vertical sidewalls for the first few feet before the arch began to curve. This single modification transformed the living experience, creating a sense of space and making the entire floor plan functional for bunks, equipment, and movement. The second major issue was the Quonset Hut's darkness and poor ventilation. It was a dank, gloomy steel tube. The Quonset team tackled this with integrated solutions. They designed a continuous ridge vent along the roof's peak, a feature largely absent from the early Quonset designs. This simple but effective addition leveraged thermodynamics, allowing hot, stale air to escape and drawing in cooler air from the sides, making the huts far more tolerable in tropical climates. Furthermore, while the Quonset relied on its open-end walls for light, the Quonset design standardized the inclusion of windows and the option for translucent roof panels, flooding the interior with natural light. A third area of improvement was in the assembly and materials. The original Quonset Hut used a complex system of frames with multiple parts and required a concrete foundation, making its erection a more involved process. The Quonset's T-rib system was simpler, more robust, and designed for rapid assembly on a variety of foundations, from simple wooden skids to packed earth. The use of superior galvanized steel for the Quonset, as opposed to the plain corrugated iron of the early Quonset huts, also provided much better resistance to rust and corrosion, a critical upgrade for the salt air environments of the Pacific. This process of creative borrowing is a recurring theme in technological advancement. The American engineers displayed immense practical wisdom. They did not waste precious time and resources reinventing the wheel. Instead, they found the best available wheel and set about re-engineering it for a new, more demanding race. They took the Quonset Hut's core strength, its resilient arched form, and refined its every weakness. They made it roomier, brighter, better ventilated, easier to build, and more durable. The relationship was not lost on contemporary observers. British soldiers stationed alongside Americans often saw the Quonset as a luxurious, upscale version of their own familiar, if despised, Quonset huts. The term Quonset Hut was sometimes used generically to describe any arched military shelter, much to the chagrin of the Americans who knew their design was superior. This borrowing, however, was a testament to the shared logistical challenges of modern warfare. The problem of rapid, versatile shelter was universal. The Quonset Hut was the first serious attempt at a solution. The Quonset Hut was its ultimate evolution, a refined successor that took a good idea and, through brilliant engineering and a focus on the human experience, made it great. It was a case of one ally building upon the lessons of another, a collaboration across time and conflict that would provide a universal shelter for the greatest conflict the world had ever seen. The Quonset Hut's derisive nickname, the Giant Can, belied a profound truth. Its designers had achieved that rarest of engineering feats, a perfect marriage of form, function, and manufacturability. To dissect its anatomy is to understand a philosophy of design where every curve, every rib, and every bolt was optimized for a single purpose, to solve the U.S. Navy's impossible equation of strength, speed, and simplicity. It was a masterpiece of reduction, where complexity was not just removed, but deliberately engineered out. The soul of the Quonset Hut was its semi-cylindrical, arch-shaped form. This was not an aesthetic choice, it was a fundamental principle of physics in action. The arch is one of the oldest and most stable structural forms in engineering, renowned for its ability to distribute weight and stress evenly along its curve, channeling loads down to its foundations. This single geometric decision granted the Quonset Hut its legendary resilience. A conventional gable roof with load-bearing walls creates pressure points and vulnerabilities. The Quonset's arch, however, presented a unified, monocoque shell. When a force was applied, whether it was the pressure of an Arctic blizzard, the weight of tropical rainfall, or the concussive overpressure of a nearby bomb blast, the entire structure worked in concert to dissipate that energy. The force was translated into compression stresses that ran smoothly along the curve and into the ground, making the hut incredibly resistant to collapsing. It was, in effect, a building that could literally roll with the punches. This brilliant exterior form was given substance by its skeleton, the T-ribs. These were galvanized steel arches, typically spaced 2 feet apart, that formed the primary structural framework. Their T shape was crucial. It provided immense rigidity along the rib spine, preventing the arch from buckling under load, while the flanges of their T offered a perfect, flat surface for attaching the outer skin. These ribs were the hut's vertebrae. They were designed for maximum strength with minimum weight and, most importantly, for ease of assembly. They were interchangeable, numbered, and could be quickly slotted together on site by a small team of men, often without the need for heavy machinery. Lifting the first few ribs into place was the most delicate part of the process, but once the initial arches were braced, the structure began to become self-supporting, each new rib adding to the overall stability. The skin of this giant can was its corrugated galvanized steel sheathing. The corrugations, the repeating ridges and grooves, were not merely for aesthetic texture. They were a critical strength-enhancing feature, acting as miniature I-beams that drastically increased the panel's stiffness and load-bearing capacity without adding significant weight. This prevented the thin steel sheets from flexing, buckling, or drumming loudly in the wind. The galvanization process, which coated the steel in a layer of zinc, was their hut's immune system, providing a formidable defense against rust and corrosion in the salt spray environment of naval bases and the humid rot of jungle outposts. These sheets were attached to the T-ribs with simple bolts, and their installation followed a logical, bottom-up sequence that was virtually foolproof. Perhaps the most underappreciated aspect of the Quonset's anatomy was its foundation system. It demanded nothing more than a simple, level grade. It could be anchored to a concrete slab, to wooden skids, or even directly to a series of concrete piers or packed earth. This flexibility was a force multiplier. It meant their hut could be deployed on coral atolls with no soil, on permafrost, on the uneven ground of a freshly captured airfield, or on the soft earth of a riverbank. The building conformed to the terrain did not have to be conformed to the building. The interior of the Quonset hut was a study in functional space. The absence of internal load-bearing walls created a vast, clear-span area, an empty canvas for military necessity. Standard models were 16 feet wide and 36 feet long, but the design was modular and could be extended almost indefinitely simply by adding more ribs and more sheeting. This open floor plan meant a single hut could be whatever the moment required. With the addition of prefabricated plywood partitions, it could be divided into a barracks for 20 men, their bunks lining the curved walls. The same space could become a machine shop, a communications center humming with radio equipment, a surgical ward with operating tables under the bright electric lights hung from the arch, or a warehouse stacked high with crates of rations and ammunition. The two end walls, made of plywood and featuring doors and windows, were the only custom elements, and even these were often standardized. Ventilation and light were ingeniously integrated. The standard design included a continuous slot ventilator running the length of the roof's peak. This simple feature capitalized on the physics of hot air rising, passively drawing stifling interior air out and creating a cooling flow. Combined with the option for screened openings in the end walls, this system fought back against the oppressive heat of tropical bases. For light, the corrugated steel could be replaced with transparent or translucent plastic panels, bathing the interior in diffuse, shadow-free daylight, a critical feature for a field hospital or a detailed repair shop. In its complete form, the Quonset hut stood as a testament to the principle that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Its genius was not in a single, revolutionary component, but in the harmonious integration of off-the-shelf materials and timeless physics into a new, holistic system. It was strong yet lightweight, simple yet incredibly versatile, cheap yet extraordinarily durable. Every element of its anatomy, from the grand curve of its arch down to the pattern of its corrugations, served a deliberate and essential purpose. It was not just a building, it was a perfectly tuned instrument for war, designed to be played by anyone, anywhere. The brilliant design of the Quonset hut would have been nothing more than a theoretical exercise, a fascinating set of blueprints gathering dust on a Navy engineer's desk, without an equally brilliant system for its creation. Their hut's revolutionary potential lay not just in its curved steel walls, but in its ability to be borne by the tens of thousands from America's industrial heartland. The Quonset hut was a child of mass production, a testament to the nation's unique ability to transform raw material and engineering principles into a flood of identical, perfect objects. Its journey from a Pennsylvania steel mill to a jungle clearing in New Guinea was a logistical ballet as impressive as any military operation, a miracle of scale, efficiency, and purpose-driven manufacturing. The process began with the most critical and symbolic material of the Second World War, steel. The demand was astronomical, and the allocation of this strategic resource was a matter of national priority. The steel for Quonset huts was not a specialty order, it was part of the vast river of industrial output that fed the arsenal of democracy. The sheets began as raw steel, which was then passed through a galvanizing process, emerging coated in a protective layer of zinc to fight the relentless enemies of rust and corrosion. This was the first step in ensuring their huts' longevity in the field. These large, flat sheets were then fed through massive, deafeningly loud corrugating machines. These machines, with their powerful, interlocking rollers, stamped the distinctive ridges and grooves into the steel. This was not merely for aesthetic texture, it was a crucial act of industrial strengthening. With each pass through the rollers, the flat, flexible sheet was transformed into a rigid, structural panel, its strength-to-weight ratio dramatically increased by the corrugated pattern that acted as a series of miniature I-beams. Simultaneously, in other parts of the factory, the skeletal structure of their hut was being born. The T-ribs, the critical arches that gave the Quonset its shape and strength, were pressed or rolled from steel. The genius of their T-shape was not just structural, it was also manufacturable. It was a simple, repetitive profile that could be produced in endless, identical segments. The end walls, typically made of plywood to allow for easy customization for doors and windows, were cut and assembled on separate lines. Every component, from the largest steel sheet to the smallest, most mundane bolt and washer, was specified, sourced, and produced to exacting standards. There was no room for variation. A rib produced in a factory in Illinois had to fit perfectly with a steel panel made in Ohio and be bolted together by a weary CB in the Philippines. This was the principle of interchangeability, a cornerstone of American industry, applied to architecture. The true magic, however, happened at the end of the production line, the packing and crating. This was where the Quonset hut was prepared for its journey to the front, and it was here that its logistical genius became fully apparent. The engineers designed the entire system with shipping efficiency as a primary constraint. Every piece was designed to nest, to stack, and to pack with geometric perfection. The curved steel sheets were bundled together. The T-ribs were stacked in neat piles. All the smaller components, the bolts, the nuts, the brackets, and the assembly instructions, were packed into a separate, smaller box. Everything for a single 36-foot hut was then loaded into a single, robust, weatherproof wooden crate. The dimensions of this crate were not arbitrary, they were calculated to maximize the use of space in the hold of a standard Liberty ship or Victory ship. These crates could be stacked like giant, heavy bricks, transforming the chaotic problem of shipping building materials into the orderly, efficient process of moving standardized containers. A single ship could carry the components for an entire base, a floating city in a box, ready to be assembled on any shoreline in the world. This compactness also allowed for delivery by means other than ship. Quonset hut crates could be slung under transport planes, dropped by parachute to isolated units, or towed on rafts up jungle rivers, ensuring that even the most remote outpost could have the shelter it needed. The scale of this production effort was staggering. The two primary manufacturers, the Steel Corporation, a division of Great Lakes Steel, and the Borg-Warner Company, operated their production lines around the clock. They became factories in the purest sense of the word, vast, noisy temples of output where raw materials entered at one end and finished, crated huts emerged at the other. At the peak of production, a new Quonset hut was being completed every single hour. By the war's end, over 150,000 of these structures had been produced and shipped to every corner of the globe. They poured out of American factories in an unending stream, a tangible manifestation of the nation's industrial might. This mass production miracle had a profound psychological impact. For the soldiers and sailors receiving these crates, the Quonset hut was more than just shelter, it was a piece of home, a symbol of the immense power that was now backing them up. The very act of unpacking the perfectly fitted parts and assembling the structure was a morale-boosting exercise in order and competence. It was a physical representation of their arsenal of democracy in action. The Quonset hut was forged from scrap, but it was more than just steel. It was forged from the collective will of a nation that had mobilized its entire industrial base for a single purpose: to provide its fighting men with the tools for victory, down to the very roofs over their heads. The blueprints were perfect. The factory production was a marvel of efficiency. But the true test of the Quonset Hut's design lay thousands of miles away from American drafting tables and assembly lines, in the most hostile environments on Earth. The war was a global laboratory of extreme conditions, and the Quonset Hut was thrust into a brutal, real-world experiment. It faced a gauntlet of trials that no single building had ever been designed to endure, from the mind-numbing cold of the Arctic to the flesh-rotting heat of the tropics. Its performance under these conditions would determine not just its utility, but its legacy. The first great trial came in the frigid, windswept theaters of the North Atlantic and the Aleutian Islands. In places like Iceland, Greenland, and the Alaskan frontier, the Quonset Hut faced an enemy as relentless as any army: the Arctic winter. The primary threat was snow load. Traditional flat or pitched roofs could accumulate tons of snow, leading to catastrophic collapse. But the Quonset's arched form proved to be its salvation. The steep, curved profile offered little purchase for snow to accumulate. What did settle would often slide off under its own weight, a phenomenon engineers call shedding. The immense strength of the arched T-ribs could easily bear the weight of what snow remained, distributed evenly across the entire structure. More critically, the huts provided a vital, weathertight refuge from the screaming gales that could strip the heat from a man in minutes. Inside, even a single pot-bellied stove could raise the temperature to a habitable level, the steel skin acting as a barrier against the elements that meant the difference between life and death for mechanics working on aircraft engines or radio men monitoring distant frequencies. Yet, for every problem solved, the environment presented another. The very steel that kept out the wind became a conduit for the cold, causing condensation to rain down on the occupants inside. Troops quickly learned to line the interiors with whatever material they could find: mattress straw, cardboard from crates, and most effectively, surplus insulation or plywood. This unofficial modification created a dead air space, trapping heat and stopping the condensation, demonstrating the hut's adaptability and the ingenuity of its inhabitants. In the Aleutians, where a persistent, freezing fog could coat everything in a layer of rime ice, the galvanized steel resisted the corrosive dampness that would have rotted a wooden structure in a single season. At the opposite end of the climatic spectrum, the Quonset Hut faced an entirely different set of challenges in the South Pacific. Here, the enemy was not the cold, but a triple threat of heat, humidity, and torrential rain. The initial reaction of men unloaded onto a steamy, coral atoll was that the steel hut would become an unbearable oven. And indeed, when sitting in the direct tropical sun, the exterior could become too hot to touch. But the designer's foresight in including the continuous ridge vent transformed the hut's performance. This feature acted as the building's lungs. As the sun heated the air inside, it would rise and escape through the peak, creating a vacuum that drew in cooler air from the screened openings at the ends or sides. This passive ventilation system prevented the hut from becoming a stagnant, suffocating trap and made it surprisingly livable. The open, clear-span interior also allowed for maximum air circulation, a critical factor in preventing the spread of fungal infections and disease. The monsoon rains presented another test. The corrugated steel skin was, of course, completely waterproof. But it was the arch shape again that proved invaluable against the phenomenal downpours. The curved roof channeled the water efficiently off its sides, preventing pooling and the subsequent leaks that would have plagued a flat roof. In jungle clearings, where rainfall could be measured in feet rather than inches, this simple ability to shed water kept equipment dry, supplies safe, and hospital patients protected from the elements. The hut's resistance to the jungle's biological onslaught, mold, termites, and rot, was a key advantage over any organic building material. While canvas mildewed and wood decayed, the galvanized steel stood impervious. Perhaps the most unexpected and brutal trial was the Quonset Hut's performance under enemy fire. While not designed as a bomb shelter, its arched, monocoque structure displayed a remarkable resilience to the effects of warfare. The curved shape proved highly effective at deflecting shrapnel and debris from nearby explosions. More significantly, the structure was adept at handling blast overpressure. The shockwave from a bomb does not merely travel in a straight line, it wraps around objects. The Quonset's smooth, curved form allowed these pressure waves to flow around it with less resistance than a boxy building with flat walls, which would bear the full brunt of the force and often collapse. There are numerous accounts of Quonset huts surviving near misses that reduced traditional structures to splinters, their interiors and occupants spared by the simple genius of their shape. This global trial by combat forged an unshakable reputation. The Quonset hut was not a perfect building, it could be hot, it could be cold, it could be loud under rainfall. But it was a building that endured. It proved itself to be the most adaptable, resilient, and reliable structure yet devised for military use. A commander could be confident that if he had a crate containing a Quonset hut, he could provide secure shelter for his men and his mission within a day, whether he was on a glacier, a coral atoll, or a bomb-cratered airstrip. It had passed the ultimate test, not in a laboratory, but on the front lines of a world at war, becoming an indestructible icon in the process. The true measure of the Quonset hut's genius was not its ability to perform a single function, but its chameleon-like capacity to become whatever the war effort demanded. It was a building of 1,000 faces, a universal shell that enclosed the full spectrum of human experience in wartime, from the brutal mechanics of death to the fragile comforts of life. The empty, arching space within its corrugated steel walls became a stage for the drama of a global conflict, proving itself to be far more than a mere shelter. It was a workshop, a hospital, a chapel, a command center, and, for countless thousands, a fleeting and unlikely home. Perhaps its most vital transformation, after barracks, was into the field hospital. The clearspan interior of the Quonset was a gift to military doctors. Unobstructed by pillars or walls, the space could be organized with clinical efficiency. Under the bright, unforgiving light of bulbs hung from the steel ribs, surgeons performed miracles and tragedies on operating tables arranged in rows. The smooth, hard surfaces of the end walls and the potential for a concrete floor made it easier to maintain a sterile environment than in a tent. The ridge vent, so crucial for ventilation in the tropics, here helped to evacuate the smell of antiseptic, blood, and sweat. Wards were created by lining the curved walls with cots, where wounded men from Iwo Jima or the Hurtgen forest recovered, the arched ceiling a silent, metallic witness to their pain and resilience. In the cold theaters, a single stove could heat the entire space. In the tropics, the open ends allowed for a constant flow of air. For the men whose lives were saved within them, the distinct, curved silhouette of the Quonset hut became a symbol of survival. Simultaneously, just down the road, another Quonset hut would be roaring with the sound of industry, having been converted into a frontline workshop. The same open floor plan that served a hospital was perfect for housing the machinery of war repair. The strength of the structure could support chain hoists for lifting aircraft engines or tank transmissions. Mechanics benches, lathes, and welding equipment were arranged in efficient lines under the same arched roof. Here, the hut was not a place of healing, but of resurrection. Crippled jeeps were made whole again, radios were repaired, and damaged weapons were brought back to life. The Quonset became the beating heart of military logistics, a place where American ingenuity was applied not to design, but to desperate, immediate repair. The oil-stained floors and the smell of cutting torches and grease were a world away from the antiseptic silence of the hospital, yet the same basic structure accommodated both with equal facility. The hut also housed the brain of the military organism, the command center. With its plywood end walls partitioned into offices, a Quonset could become the headquarters for a battalion, a wing, or a naval base. Here, maps of enemy territory were pinned to walls, field telephones buzzed, and typewriters clacked as orders were drafted and reports filed. The building provided security from the elements and a degree of acoustic privacy, allowing for the concentration necessary to direct complex operations. It was in these unassuming structures that the strategies for the next assault were planned, and the fates of thousands were decided. Beyond these official functions, the Quonset hut served the profound human need for normalcy and solace. It became a chapel, where a simple altar and rows of makeshift pews offered soldiers a moment of peace and a connection to the world they had left behind. It became a movie theater, where the clatter of a projector provided a precious escape into fantasy for an hour. It became a post-exchange, a barbershop, and a library. It was a space for community, for gathering, for forgetting the war for a few fleeting moments. And, for nearly every American who served overseas, the Quonset Hut was, simply, home. It was the place where he slept, stored his few personal possessions, and wrote letters to his family. The curved walls, often lined with footlockers and bunks, became a deeply personal space. Soldiers pinned photographs of loved ones and pin-up girls to the plywood lining, creating a small pocket of individuality in the vast, impersonal machine of war. The sound of rain drumming on the corrugated steel roof became the soundtrack of their overseas lives, a sound that would, for many, evoke powerful memories for decades to come. It was a cramped, often uncomfortable home, but it was their home, a familiar constant in a world of chaos and displacement. This incredible versatility was the Quonset Hut's ultimate triumph. It was a neutral container, a blank canvas upon which the necessities of war and the needs of the human spirit were projected. A single design could, in the space of a day, be transformed from a deafening machine shop into a silent chapel, from a crowded barracks into a solitary command post. It sheltered the general and the private, the surgeon and the mechanic, the living and the dying. The Quonset Hut did not define its occupants, it adapted to them. In doing so, it became more than a triumph of engineering, it became a ubiquitous and deeply human backdrop to the greatest conflict in history, a simple, curved roof over the complex, sprawling endeavor of a world at war. The Quonset Hut was conceived as a shield against nature, a defense against wind, rain, and sun. Its architects never listed artillery shell or bomb blast among its design specifications. Yet, in the brutal, unforgiving laboratory of the battlefield, their humble hut revealed an unexpected and life-saving characteristic: it was remarkably resilient to the destructive forces of modern warfare. This was not a feature that could be fully predicted on the drawing board, it was a happy, and often decisive, accident of physics, a serendipitous byproduct of the very same principles that made it storm-proof. In a war defined by ever more powerful explosives, the Quonset Hut's passive resistance became an unplanned tactical asset, a silent, stationary warrior that saved countless lives and preserved vital war material. The secret, once again, lay in its iconic arch. On a structural level, the curved form was a master of deflection. Shrapnel from a mortar round or a grenade, traveling on a relatively flat trajectory, was far more likely to glance harmlessly off the steeply sloped sides of a Quonset Hut than to penetrate it. Unlike a flat-walled wooden structure that would absorb the full kinetic energy of a shell fragment, presenting a perpendicular target that could be torn to splinters, the Quonset's skin sent the deadly projectiles ricocheting away. This was not an absolute defense against a direct hit from a large-caliber shell, but against the ubiquitous, deadly spray of fragmentation that characterized frontline combat, it offered a significant degree of protection. Soldiers quickly learned that being inside a Quonset Hut was vastly safer than being in a tent or a traditional building during a shelling or air raid. This defensive capability was even more pronounced when facing the other primary killer on the battlefield: blast over pressure. The detonation of a high-explosive shell or bomb does not just shatter and propel shrapnel, it creates a spherical shockwave of compressed air that travels outward at supersonic speeds. This overpressure wave is what collapses lungs, ruptures eardrums, and knocks down buildings. When this wave encounters a structure, it does not simply push against it, it wraps around it. This is where the Quonset Hut's aerodynamic form provided a critical advantage. A rectangular building with flat walls and a gabled roof presents a series of flat, perpendicular surfaces to the blast wave. These surfaces bear the full, concentrated force of the pressure, which slams into them like an invisible tidal wave. The result is often catastrophic failure: walls are blown in, roofs are lifted and collapsed, and the structure is reduced to rubble. The Quonset Hut, with its continuous, smooth, curved surface, presented no such flat planes for the shockwave to push against. The pressure wave was forced to flow around the structure, much like water flows around a smooth stone in a river. While their hut would still shudder violently and the air inside would compress with a deafening crump, the structure itself was far more likely to remain standing. The even distribution of stress along its arched ribs prevented the localized failures that doomed conventional buildings. There are numerous anecdotal accounts from across the theaters of war that attest to this resilience. On Pacific islands like Guam and Saipan, after pre-invasion naval bombardments that leveled most Japanese-built structures, the Quonset huts erected by the Seabees often remained standing, scarred and pockmarked, but structurally sound. In Europe, forward airfields frequently came under Luftwaffe attack, and while hangars and administrative buildings were targeted, the Quonset huts used for maintenance and barracks frequently survived near misses that left craters just meters from their foundations. Their huts would be covered in dirt and debris, their windows blown out, but their steel skeletons held fast. This unintended defensive strength had a profound psychological impact on the troops who lived and worked in them. In an environment defined by random violence and a pervasive sense of vulnerability, the Quonset hut provided a tangible sense of security. Its solid, metallic presence was a reassurance. The drumming of rain on the roof was a familiar, comforting sound. The shudder of the hut during a nearby explosion was a visceral reminder that it was protecting them. This boost to morale was incalculable. A soldier who could trust his shelter to withstand an attack was a soldier who could rest more deeply, work more effectively, and maintain his fighting spirit for longer. Furthermore, this resilience had a direct and measurable impact on military logistics and continuity of operations. A machine shop housed in a Quonset hut that survived a bombing raid could be back in operation within hours, once the debris was cleared and the equipment checked. A field hospital that remained intact could continue to receive and treat wounded without having to relocate its vulnerable patients. A command center could maintain communications and control without its vital maps and radios being buried in rubble. The Quonset hut, by simply staying upright, ensured that the complex machinery of a military base could keep functioning under duress. In this sense, the Quonset hut transcended its role as a passive shelter and became an active contributor to combat effectiveness. It was a fortress that wasn't designed to be won, a stronghold born from logistics rather than tactics. Its arch, conceived for shedding snow and resisting wind, became a form of innate armor. Its corrugated steel skin, designed for cheap, fast production, became a shield against shrapnel. The Quonset hut proved that in total war, every element of the effort, down to the most humble building, becomes a part of the fight. And in its quiet, steadfast defiance of bombs and shells, it earned its place not just as an icon of American supply, but as an unsung hero of defense. The Quonset hut's triumphs over Arctic blasts and bomb blasts were feats of structural integrity, tests of its skeleton and skin against brute force. But in the steamy, teeming jungles of the South Pacific, it faced a more insidious and pervasive enemy. Here, the threat was not a single, catastrophic event, but a constant, corrosive assault on man and machine alike. The jungle was a living entity that sought to consume everything left in its path, and the primary weapons in this war of attrition were humidity, heat, and rot. For the American serviceman, the jungle was a green hell that sapped his strength, rotted his boots, and rusted his rifle. For the Quonset hut, this environment presented its ultimate test of livability, a battle where its design-in features, particularly ventilation, became matters of survival. The challenge was threefold. First was the oppressive, enervating heat. Temperatures routinely soared into the 90s Fahrenheit, over 35 degrees Celsius, with a humidity level that could reach 100%. The air was thick, heavy, and difficult to breathe. A structure that trapped this air would become an unbearable oven, a metal coffin baking in the tropical sun. The second enemy was moisture. The constant humidity, combined with torrential daily downpours, created an environment where nothing stayed dry. Metal rusted, leather mold, paper disintegrated, and electronics short-circuited. The third and most biologically active threat was rot and fungal growth. Organic materials, wood, canvas, clothing, even the glue in book bindings, would bloom with multicolored mold in a matter of days. The jungle's biological agents were relentless. The initial reaction of troops upon seeing the corrugated steel huts was often despair. They imagined a sweltering, stagnant interior. But the Quonset hut's designers, in one of their most brilliant foresights, had already declared war on stagnation. The key was the continuous ridge vent, a narrow, sheltered opening that ran the entire length of the roof's peak. This was not an afterthought, it was an integral part of the structural system. This simple feature harnessed the fundamental principle of thermodynamics: hot air rises. As the sun heated the steel skin, the air inside the hut would warm and expand, becoming less dense. This hot, moist air would then naturally ascend and escape through the ridge vent. The exiting air created a vacuum, a negative pressure zone inside the hut. To equalize this pressure, cooler, denser air from outside was drawn in through the large, screened openings in the end walls and, in later models, through operable louvers installed in the side walls. This created a passive, continuous flow of air through the building, a natural air conditioning system that required no power, no moving parts, and no maintenance. It was always on. While it couldn't lower the temperature to a comfortable 72 degrees, it could prevent the interior from becoming significantly hotter than the ambient outside air, and, more importantly, it kept the air moving. This constant breeze was the difference between a stifling, suffocating box and a habitable, if warm, space. It evaporated sweat from the skin, providing a critical cooling effect, and prevented the air from becoming stagnant and foul. This ventilation system was their hut's primary weapon in the battle against rot. By constantly exchanging the humid interior air with the slightly less humid exterior air, the ridge vent dramatically reduced condensation. Without this airflow, the cool interior of their hut at night would cause moisture from the warm air to condense on the steel skin in the same way dew forms on grass. By morning, the interior would be raining. This inside rain was a common and miserable phenomenon in poorly ventilated structures. In the Quonset Hut, the ridge vent prevented this deluge, keeping equipment, bedding, and supplies significantly drier. A dry environment was a hostile environment for the mold and fungus that thrived in constant dampness. The troops, ever resourceful, developed their own tactics to enhance their hut's natural advantages. The most common was to line the interior with materials that created a dead air space, insulating against both heat and condensation. They used whatever was available: cardboard from crates, woven grass mats, and most effectively, plywood. This practice, while unofficial, was often encouraged. The plywood lining served multiple purposes. It stopped the condensation drip, it made the interior feel more like a room and less like a machine, and it provided a surface for pinning up photographs, maps, and pin-ups, offering a crucial psychological boost. It was a humanizing modification to an industrial object. The Quonset Hut's inorganic nature was its final victory over the jungle. While traditional wooden structures were a feast for termites and rot, the galvanized steel was impervious. It did not decay. It did not attract insects. A heavy rain would dry off its surface in minutes under the tropical sun. The jungle could not digest it. This durability meant that a Quonset Hut required virtually no maintenance in an environment where a wooden building would be constantly fighting a losing battle against biological decay. In the end, the Quonset Hut did not conquer the jungle's climate, no structure could. But it achieved something far more valuable: it created a defensible, sustainable enclave within it. It provided a space where radios could operate without short-circuiting, where surgical instruments could be stored without rusting, and where a soldier could get a few hours of dry, breezy sleep. The ridge vent, a simple slit at the top of the arch, was the unsung hero of this achievement. It turned a potential oven into a refuge, a metal shell into a breathable living space. In the relentless, green dampness of the Pacific War, the Quonset Hut's ability to simply stay dry and moving air was a logistical and morale victory on par with its more dramatic survival of typhoons and bombs. It was proof that in a war against nature, good design was as powerful a weapon as any gun. The end of the Second World War did not mark the end of the Quonset Hut's service, it merely signaled a dramatic change of mission. As the guns fell silent, the world was left with a surplus of everything from rations to rifles, and among this vast demobilized inventory were tens of thousands of Quonset Huts. No longer needed to house armies, they faced a potential fate as scrap metal. But the very qualities that made them a brilliant military solution, their durability, simplicity, and low cost, made them irresistible to a peacetime world desperate for cheap, rapid building solutions. Thus began the second, and in many ways more profound, life of the Quonset Hut, as it evolved from a weapon of war into an icon of pragmatic American optimism, migrating from battlefields to the backyards of a nation rebuilding itself. The mechanism for this transition was the mighty Surplus Property Administration. The U.S. government began selling off Quonset Huts for a fraction of their original cost, sometimes for as little as $1,000. This sale pricing unleashed a flood of ingenuity. Veterans, who had lived in the huts overseas, were among the first to recognize their potential. They had experienced firsthand their strength and adaptability. With the GI Bill fueling a housing boom but with traditional materials in short supply, the Quonset hut presented a ready-made answer. Families across America bought them and, with the same can-do spirit that had won the war, set about converting them into homes. This was not always a straightforward process. The curved interior posed a design challenge, and the industrial aesthetic was not to everyone's taste. But for a generation that had endured the Depression and a World War, practicality trumped convention. Homeowners built interior walls to create rectangular rooms, installed dormers for additional light and headspace, and used creative landscaping to soften their hut's stark, metallic silhouette. Their huts became affordable housing for young families, vacation cabins in the mountains, and roadside businesses. They were churches in growing suburbs and classrooms for the baby boom generation swelling school enrollments. The Quonset hut, born from the urgency of global conflict, became a foundational block of post-war American life. Its utility extended far beyond the residential sphere. The same clearspan interior that had served as a military workshop made it perfect for a peacetime factory, an airplane hangar, or a farmer's equipment shed. Its resilience made it ideal for storage in harsh climates. Universities, bursting at the seams with returning veterans, used them as temporary classrooms, laboratories, and student housing. Their tin can was, in effect, the world's first modular building system, adaptable to an astonishing array of commercial, agricultural, and institutional needs. It was architecture as a verb, not a noun, a process of doing and making, rather than a statement of style. This global diaspora cemented the Quonset hut's status as a cultural symbol. It appeared in post-war films and literature, often representing a kind of rugged, utilitarian frontier spirit. It stood as a physical reminder of the war, but also of the triumph of practical problem-solving. Its form became so iconic that it transcended its original function. The curved silhouette was instantly recognizable, a shorthand for no-nonsense efficiency. It was democracy in built form, accessible, functional, and unpretentious. The legacy of the Quonset hut is also one of profound influence on architecture and engineering. It stands as a direct ancestor of the prefabricated metal building systems that now dominate industrial and commercial construction worldwide. The principles it championed, standardized components, rapid assembly, and clearspan interiors, became the industry standard. More subtly, its success demonstrated the viability of non-rectilinear forms in mainstream construction, paving the way for the expressive use of arches and curves in modern architectural design. It was a proof of concept for thinking of buildings as kits of parts. Today, the Quonset hut is experiencing a renaissance. No longer seen merely as a cheap relic. It is now appreciated for its retrofuturist aesthetic, its sustainability, as it is often made from recycled steel and is highly energy efficient when properly insulated, and its inherent strength against natural disasters like earthquakes and hurricanes. A new generation of designers and homeowners sees in its curve not a limitation, but a unique architectural opportunity. The journey of the Quonset hut is the story of a simple idea, forged in crisis, that proved too useful to retire. It is a bridge from the industrial battlefields of the 20th century to the sustainable challenges of the 21st. From the beaches of Tarawa to a college campus in Iowa, from a field hospital in Normandy to a chic restaurant in California, the Quonset hut has demonstrated a timeless versatility. Its true legacy is not just in the steel that remains, but in the philosophy it embodies, that the best design is often the simplest, the most resilient, and the most adaptable. Their giant can that helped win a war ended up helping to build a peace, proving that a structure designed for mere survival could, in the right hands, become a vessel for a better future.